Hello, everyone. My name is Jaclyn. I am an associate professor and the director of the Center for Asian Legal Studies at the National University of Singapore Faculty of Law. I'm pleased to welcome you to what is now the 10th virtual roundtable on Asian law. This is an online series that we launched sometime in May, partly in response to the pandemic, but also to extend our outreach to legal scholars and more across Asia. The purpose of this virtual roundtable series is to bring together legal experts to share critical perspectives on topical issues on law in Asia. And we're pleased today that for our 10th iteration, we're able to host this book discussion on Professor Ran Hirschl's new book, City, State, Constitutionalism, and Megacities. Now, this book, as with Ran's previous books, draws out a new horizon for constitutional studies research, as he astutely guides us to ask, what do constitutions say about cities? Apparently very little. And Ran's brilliant book seeks to fill this constitutional blind spot, as he calls it, concerning the metropolis. He puts forth a strong argument as to why constitutions should take cities, specifically megacities, seriously, examining existing constitutional relationship or lack thereof between states and megacities worldwide, and examines patterns of change and stalemate in city status. And so in doing so, he draws our attention to the need to really put the city at the center of constitutional thought. So today's book discussion will be slightly unique, slightly unique and different from Ran's other book discussions, which I'm sure he has already done a few. We will be focusing on the Asian perspective on megacities and look at what Asia can say about constitutionalism and megacities. And we have with us today 3 experts of constitutional law, as well as an expert on law and geography. I will introduce the speakers in the order in which they will speak. First, of course, we will have Professor Ran Hirschl, who is a professor of political science and law at the University of Toronto. He is also the Humboldt Professor in Comparative Constitutionalism at the University of Göttingen and the head of the Max Planck Fellow Group in Comparative Constitutionalism. He, of course, is the author of several award-winning books and over 100 articles and book chapters on constitutional law and its intersection with comparative politics and society. Next up, we will have Mr. Matthew Idiculla, who is a research consultant with the Center for Law and Policy Research in Bangalore. He leads the work on urban law and policy and was previously with the School of Policy and Governance at Azim Premji University. Our next speaker is Professor Wen-Chen, who is also Dean at the National Chiao University. She is a widely published leading scholar of constitutional law in Taiwan and is a very well-known name in comparative constitutional studies in Asia. Our last but not least speaker would be Dr. Kevin Tan, who specializes in constitutional and administrative law and is, of course, at the National University of Singapore. He is also one of our executive committee member at the Center for Asian Legal Studies. Again, Kevin is one of our leading scholars on comparative constitutional law in Asia, and he will be sharing his perspectives also from Singapore, where it is both a city and a state. So without further ado, I will like to, my apologies, let me speak a little bit about how we will handle the question and answer for today's session. We will be using the Q&A function, which you will see at the bottom corner, right corner of the Zoom webinar platform. Please put in your questions through this Q&A function. And what we will do is collect the questions. And at the end, after all the speakers have spoken, we will deal with the questions in turn, and I will pose them to the speakers accordingly. Now, and truly now, without further ado, allow me to invite Professor Ran Hirschl to please first give his comments. Thank you. Ran.
Thank you, Jaclyn. And of course, thank you to our audience and people who tuned in. And thanks in advance to Matthew and Wen-Chen and Kevin for engaging with the arguments in this book. Let me share the screen because I've prepared a couple of slides for you. All right, so let me just say before I begin that I'm now based in Toronto, and it is around 2:40 a.m., 2:40 in the middle of the night, just to be clear, in Toronto. So everything incoherent that I may say in the next 25 minutes or so, you could blame on that. All right, so let's just jump right at it because we have a lot on the table here. What I'm going to present to you is a general overview of a recent book of mine, as Jaclyn introduced, entitled City State, Constitutionalism in the Megacity, published earlier this year with Oxford University Press, in which I try to chart a generally uncharted terrain of the place of urban agglomeration and megacities in constitutional thought. So let's move on. This is a graph or a chart that is available online. It's not part of the book, but I thought you should get a sense of the general trend we are looking at here, urbanization over the past 500 years. And of course, it's obvious what's going on over the last 200 years, and in particular over the last century. There has been tremendous urbanization worldwide. This is a graph or a chart that I created myself that is perhaps slightly more accurate, and it tells a slightly different story or more detailed story. The purple line, the top line, represents world population in billions over time, and the blue line represents the world urban population in billions. And what you can see here is that the two lines are roughly parallel. So the meaning of that is that the vast majority of world population, or the increase in world population over the last 70 years or so, translated into tremendous urban growth in terms of population. This is another way of slicing the data, and the brownish line represents urban population worldwide. The green line represents rural population, and of course the proportions, I mean, it need not be explained, and it speaks for itself. This is another way of looking at the data worldwide. And the left-hand side of the table represents proportion of urban population of total population over time. And the right-hand side of the table, the actual size of urban population. And if you look at Asia, you can see that whereas in 1960, there were only 360 million throughout Asia urban dwellers, the projection for 2050 is tenfold higher than that. And in Africa, although the numbers, the absolute numbers are slightly lower, the ratio of growth is even more almost borders on dystopian. We will get back to that in a minute. This is another way of showing the same trend, and the green line here represents Asia. And this is very relevant for our talk because obviously it shows that Asia, of all the continents, is a major site of urban growth, urban agglomeration, and the rise of megacities. The orangish line is Africa. The silver line is Latin America and the Caribbean. And we can see that in Europe and in North America, urban growth has been steady, but nothing spectacular compared to Asia and other so-called global south destinations. Another way of looking at the same information is this one. And the shares of urban population Up until 2018, 88% of global growth in urban population took place in the so-called global south, and the projection for the next 30 years is that roughly 96% of the growth in the next 30 years will take place in the global south. Obviously, that translates into a rise in the number of megacities over time, and that graph speaks for itself and needs no further explanation. Let's look a little bit at the numbers in megacity expansion in slightly more, greater detail. So we see that, city population over 1 million, the numbers again tell a stunning story. And when we look at the bottom of the slide, the UN projection for the end of the 21st century is that quarter of the world's population will be living in the world's 100 largest cities, and that cities such as Lagos, Kinshasa, Dar es Salaam, Mumbai, and Karachi will have a population of between 70 and 85 million people. Currently, the largest city is Tokyo, with an estimated population of 38 to 40 million. One of the major phenomena that comes with urban agglomeration is extreme density. And this is a major issue that I try to address in the book, the spatial dimension of constitutional thought, and to the extent to which we are caught in a framework that is possibly irrelevant to today's reality in terms of density. The numbers here are absolutely stunning. Dhaka is the densest city in the world, has approximately 46,000 people per square kilometer. For those of you who think in miles, that's 120,000 people per square mile. And you have some other cities in comparison, including Hong Kong, Singapore, etc. And when we zoom in on certain neighborhoods within large cities, we see that Dhaka is not even scratching the top, and that certain so-called urban slums have density that is much higher than that. And of course, the unofficial and dubious world record holder in that respect is Dharavi in Mumbai, that has an overall density of 300,000 people per square kilometer, and that's the equivalent of the entire world population squeezed into the state of Vermont. We are all expert in American states these days, and or squeezing the entire, or something like 200 or 210 million into Singapore to get the same density. Another way of looking at this is this rather accessible and obvious illustration. So we have Los Angeles, Hong Kong, Dhaka, mind you, the densest city in the world, and Dharavi in Mumbai. And this is how some of these cities look. This is at the outskirts of Lagos, Nigeria. And I hope you can see the picture. This is Dhaka, Bangladesh. And I hope you have the photo on your screens. This is Mumbai. And of course, that picture tells a story that we will get to in a minute. Okay, so that's the background. Extensive urban agglomeration and urbanization worldwide, with Asia taking the lead. Here is what I try to do in the book. The book has several main themes. I won't be able to cover all of them today, but just to give you an overview, the first theme that I address is the gap between the extensive study of the urban scene in the human sciences and virtual silence in constitutional thought, and why is that silence? The second is, what do constitutions say and do not say about cities? The third is the constitutional law and politics of city status, and how are we to explain the fact that to the extent that there has been innovation in city status in national constitutions, it was largely concentrated in the so-called global south. And how are we to explain this? So the global south clearly has taken the lead in that respect. The fourth thing that I try to do in the book is an attempt to materialize Henri Lefebvre's Right to the City. For those of you who are into political theory probably have read this seminal work. It has been completely ignored by constitutional scholars. The right to the city remains rather fuzzy. Another way of putting this is, can cities serve as constituent units in constitutional theory? Can we refer to cities rather than states or other subnational units? And specifically, I look at what makes cities unique, density, super diversity, massive inequality, subsidiarity and stakeholding theory, etc. What cities aim to do, urban citizenship, human rights cities, international city networks, and what concepts and doctrines from constitutional law may be put forward in support of granting cities enhanced constitutional standing. I talk about, joint electoral districts, in other constitutional designs. And finally, innovative constitutional designs for addressing the rural-urban divide, which obviously is a major phenomenon, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about it later. Let me explore in a bit of detail 2 of those 5 themes. We don't have the time to do more. So here you have a nice outline of some of the major works in the human sciences talking about cities. And of course, we have classic works of political theory and utopian social thought, and we have novel thinking about urbanization in cities. And most of you have heard about Saskia Sassen's work about global cities, and economists' work about economies of scale, and Paul Krugman, another Glazer at Harvard, and others. Richard Florida on cities and the creative class. Benjamin Barber's work, if mayors rule the world, etc. So by stark contrast, very little of this intellectual flurry has penetrated constitutional law, let alone comparative constitutional law, where it is virtually non-existent. And that's one of the things I try to do in the book. So here we have 3 major handbooks on comparative constitutional law. And I should, for the sake of full disclosure, say that I'm a contributor to, I believe, 2 of those. And some of you may be other contributors in the audience. And we have here a total of more than 130 chapters stretched over more than 2,500 pages without a single chapter on the constitutional status of cities, which I think is a major void in the literature. That if there's one message you should take from my book is, this is inexplicable and it has to be addressed by constitutional thinkers. Why the constitutional blind spot? I speculate that there are at least 4 reasons for that. One is, of course, constitutional rigidity and path dependence. Some of the constitutions were adopted well before the urbanization trend took off. And there is path dependence in scholarship as well. A second, and this is theoretically significant, I think, is what I call spatial statism. The idea that there is this embedded Westphalian statist outlook in national constitutional orders and constitutional thought that dictates this thinking about the constitutional order in statist terms rather than contemplating the possibility of other constituent units. Also, cities may be viewed by states as potential competitors, in particular in situations that are tense politically. And what we've seen in Hong Kong, in Santiago de Chile, in Cairo, in American cities, the last 6 months, etc., may suggest that control of cities is not a bad idea if you are a state. And finally, large cities are consistently more diverse, cosmopolitan, and socially progressive than the rest of the country. And we have numerous examples here. Let me zoom in just on 2, even in Istanbul and Budapest, 2 of the, as we're talking Turkey and Hungary, presumably nationalism, populism, etc. Even in those countries, 2 progressive mayors were elected very recently in Istanbul and in Budapest in direct defiance of the nationalist populist regimes in those countries. Let me cover briefly, really, in a couple of minutes, some of the, just a very brief account of the status of cities in some constitutions worldwide, which is the second theme I'm going to address today. So we hear a lot about the US, but the fact is that American cities are absolutely not represented in the American constitutional order. There are two doctrines that control the status of cities in the US, and the two leading decisions date over a century back to the early 20th century. The result is that we've seen extensive preemptive state legislation designed to tame progressive legislation that emanates from the city level, including, minimum wage, sick leave, sanctuary city policies, anti-tobacco, soda tax, gun control ordinances, and so on. We normally think of Canada as a more progressive jurisdiction in North America. Not that there is much competition, but the fact is that Canadian cities are, constitutionally speaking, even in a worse, to the extent that this is possible, status than American cities. So Canadian cities are completely subject to provincial governments. We won't go into details, but the legislation, the constitutional provision that governs the status of cities in Canada dates back to 1867, so over 150 years ago, when the population of Toronto, my hometown, was 50,000. It is now 7.5 million, home to 20% of Canada's population. Every second immigrant to Canada settles in Toronto. At the bottom, you have a photo that I think is telling. These are the founding fathers of the Canadian Constitution. How many of you can recognize them? Probably very few, but at the center standing is John A. Macdonald, the founding father of the Canadian Constitution. So why is this photo here? For three reasons. Number one, all male. Number two, all white. Compare that with current urban situation in Toronto and elsewhere. And number three, look at the view through the window. Clearly not an urban scene. So we can just imagine what was the state of mind of the people who envisioned the Canadian Constitution back then. As opposed to the situation in many quote unquote global north destinations or places or countries, several global south countries and constitutions have taken the lead in terms of innovation. And this is an important point. It's one of the important areas of constitutional law and comparative constitutional law where innovation comes from the global south. And it's critical. Why is that? I speculate that there are at least two reasons. One is, of course, necessity. And we just saw that 95% of urban growth takes place in the global south. But mostly greater constitutional flexibility, that because we have more newer constitutional orders, and because we have political interests and incentives that perhaps more easily help shape the constitutional order, we get to see some innovation. A few novel attempts to strengthen constitutional protection for cities, and I just picked three in the book. Those of you who have read the book will know that I addressed many, many examples, but three leading examples, some more successful than others, as we will hear later, I'm sure, is Brazil, a pioneer in that respect, that adopted a protection to cities in its 1988 constitution and transitioned from authoritarian to new democratic constitution. India, that adopted a pair of amendments, the second of which refers to cities, the first more to smaller settlements and local government. It has not been a great success, I might say, and Matthew later will explain, I'm sure, why. The third and perhaps the most important innovation worldwide in that respect is South Africa, and we have an entire chapter of the South African Constitution that addresses the status of cities in a direct reversal of the apartheid policy with respect to inner city, let's call them that way, neighborhoods. Um, Perhaps the most recent illustration of constitutionalization of city status took place in Mexico City, where we're talking about 20 million people. Mexico City moved from federal status, being controlled by the federal government, to getting a status identical to that of any other Mexican state. And to that extent, the national constitution had to be changed. And Mexico City adopted a new constitution for itself as a new state. And that is tremendously progressive constitution with LGBTQ rights and the right to have an abortion and other important innovations. Coming to an end of my quick presentation, because really there's no way in 25 minutes I can do justice to, if I may say so, a book of the scope. And as a transition to what is to follow in our panel today, we may raise a question, and I think the answer is yes, whether Asia may be a constitutional, may serve as a constitutional laboratory for studying the status of cities and what may be done. And when we look at the facts, we see that, of course, we saw it earlier, a dramatic urbanization rate, by far the largest among the world's continents. Asia is home to the world's two most populous countries, of course, China and India. Just those two are home to approximately 3 billion people. 36 of the world's 50 largest cities are located in Asia, which is, of course, a stunning fact. And of course, we have a range of models, some of which are, of course, Singapore as a city-state, Hong Kong as a special administrative region. I call it, the Asian Tigers model, China, Korea, South Korea, Vietnam, where the Constitution designates a couple of megacities in an attempt to generate economic growth and regional development. This is not a bottom-up, democratically oriented constitutionalization as opposed to Brazil or South Africa or Mexico City. This is a different model. I call it the Asian Tigers, but you understand what I'm trying to say here. And of course, we have the Indian model with Amendments 73 and 74. The success has been partial at best, and some might argue that hasn't been much success at all. And then we have also in Asia, capital city politics that is very interesting for comparative constitutional researchers. There is Dhaka with its bifurcation saga that I talk in the book. You're basically, the city is split into two parts due to politics. And Manila, that is governed through presidential decree, and Jakarta relocation, we just heard about that earlier this year or last year, and so on. So Asia can certainly serve as a fascinating yet largely underexplored, with very few exceptions, laboratory for studying the status of constitutional status of cities. To conclude, and I hope I'm not in a major violation of my time here, spatial dimensions of constitutional governance require rethinking. And of course, what I did in this very brief presentation, due to the time limitations, is just to address in some detail 2 of the 5 things I do in the book. I left from this presentation the entire normative part and the constitutional design part that may come up in the Q&A on how to rethink these things and what are the normative basis for perhaps granting cities greater constitutional powers. Urban agglomeration is, in my opinion, one of the 2 or 3 most burning challenges we face as humanity. And it's in the same league as environmental protection and climate change. And for some reason, it has not received its due attention. In the face of such I think, unequivocal evidence from across the scientific spectrum. I argue in the book that the silence of constitutional theory and of constitutional law with respect to the mounting urban challenge is striking and inexplicable, and that new thinking about constitutionalism and urbanization is the call of the hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Ran. Thank you for that overview of your book. I'm sure many of us would be very keen to go out and buy this book, although we just noticed that it is currently out of stock on the OUP website. But I'm sure they will restock very soon. So next up, we will have Matthew, who will be speaking from his research and engaging with Ran's book from the perspective of India, which is, of course, one of the major case studies that Ran mentioned earlier. Matthew, on to you.
Thanks, Jaclyn, and thanks, CLS, for inviting me to this forum. It's a great honor to be a discussant here and to be part of an illustrious panel to discuss a very important book, both for constitutional law scholars as well as urban studies scholars in general. I'll, in my quick intervention of about 10 to 12 minutes, I'll first highlight why this book is important in general, and then in the second part, I would focus the attention on the question of Asia and India in particular. So that's how I would like to structure it. Firstly, I think why this book is really important. I do think it makes a significant contribution towards scholarship for maybe three reasons. Firstly, as it's already been mentioned, it breaks the constitutional silence on cities and places cities in the center of constitutional thought. The silence or the lack of scholarship is, I believe, on two aspects. One is legal scholars haven't looked at the power of cities and the legal aspects of urban governance. Legal scholars haven't looked at it. Secondly, social science scholarship on cities have grown a lot, but the social science scholarship haven't adequately looked at the legal power of cities. When they speak about the increasing power of cities, they have not looked at the legal power of cities in the social science scholarship. What Dr. Hirschl's book does in many ways, it marries these sort of two disciplinary trends and allows a conversation between them and places the legal sort of ideas strongly within a broader social science lens. Especially chapter 1 of the book does a very good job in placing the rise of cities in that perspective. And one more thing, from a very sort of urban studies constitutional law perspective, it elevates the discussion of the legal power of cities to an idea within constitutionalism, because what we have noticed so far is that discussions on urban local government have often been reduced to discussions on local government law, as a niche area, and it is not seen as an idea within constitutionalism. So what this book does is that it places it within ideas of constitutionalism, and I think it does a great job in that. So that's the first thing. The second major and more important in today's discussion is that it actually rescues the discussion on urban law from North America. It rescues the discussion on urban law from the US mostly, and takes it to a global comparative law perspective, accounting for global South, because the limited scholarship on cities and local government have been mostly centered around the US and to some extent Canada and other English-speaking world. I mean, we have good scholars here. We have Gerald Frugg, Richard Briffaut, Richard Schrager, very great works on urban law and relationship of legal power of cities, but they have more or less not engaged with anything beyond the very narrow American sort of perspective on local local government law. This breaks it and opens up and discusses urban law scholarship from a perspective where, from the perspective where much of the urban world actually lives and not where the academic institutions are located. Though, of course, Dr. Hirschl happens to be located in North America itself. It's great that it engages with the global South and Asia in particular. And as already explained, China, Japan, Vietnam, Korea, Vietnam, India's, these are some of the cases that have been looked into, and I think it's really important in that regard. I'll be speaking about that further, and finally, I'll make a point about. I think it also makes a very important normative point about why we need why we need the empowerment of local governments or empowerment of city governments, which are different and distinct from earlier arguments on the need for legal empowerment of city governments. Earlier you should be sort of stuck in arguments of fiscal federalism, economic efficiency, and participative democracy. Dr. Hirschl's book has taken it further and speaks about electoral parity, aspects of climate change, aspects of social diversity of cities. So in that way, the normative argument is also in some ways new. I'm not going to talk about that much because it may not be the focus of today's discussion. So that's broadly, I would say, the key contribution of the book. And now specifically, getting into the Asian and Indian context, I think, as I mentioned, one of the key arguments that Dr. Hirschl makes is that the old world constitutional orders are stuck, in their systems, and global South and Asia presents what he calls new world constitutional orders, which offers interesting constitutional innovations for accounting cities, within constitutional theory. And I think this is a very important point, and we have examples, mentioned. One is the kind of Asian tiger model that we see. The other is more, straightforward constitutional law amendment, route. And the second aspect would be, captured by India, South Africa, and Brazil. The Asian tiger model is slightly distinct in terms of the constitutional innovation there. So let me focus on the second aspect, which is the constitutional amendment route towards urban sort of centric constitutional view. India is obviously one of the key parties here. They passed the 73rd and 74th Amendment, which provided cities with a clear role within which is actually given constitutional status to city governments, and also made it mandatory that every area should have an urban or a rural local government. So that's what it does. That's what it did in 92, 93. Now, as Dr. Hirschl also mentioned, the success of it is very debatable. To put it, that's the best way you can put it, because city governments are still not powerful, either constitutionally or legally or even politically, right? So why would that be the case? I just take the next 4.5 minutes that I have to explain why despite constitutional amendment, city governments in India continue to be weak in many regards. I would, from a constitutional lens, I would point it in two different reasons for this disjuncture between constitutional promise and constitutional reality. The first one is about the inherent defects or the inherent problems within the constitutional design of the 74th Amendment, which provided for urban local government. So that's the first type of reason. The second is about how the constitutional vision has been interpreted and implemented both by state governments as well as by the courts, right? So these are the two broad reasons. On the first reason, I would say that despite constitutional amendment, the actual, India has a federal constitution. The federal relations haven't been completely altered. Division of constitutional powers are still, even after constitutional amendments and reforms, between two levels of government, union and state. And that main sort of formulation has not been disturbed. That's the first aspect. Secondly, many of the provisions within the 74th Amendment actually are not mandatory. They say that the state may endow powers or devolve powers to the local government. It is a discretionary provision, and obviously when you offer discretion, the states have been reluctant to hand over powers and devolve powers to the city government. So there's an inherent weakness there. And thirdly, I would say that the inherent weakness within the amendment is that it does not provide for an independent domain of taxation for local governments. So it is again up to the state legislatures to decide what kinds of taxes the local government can levy. It does not have an independent domain of taxation. So city governments still tend to be highly reliant on grants from both the union government and the state government. So in all these three ways, the design of the Constitution itself is not far-reaching. That's a design question. In terms of implementation and interpretation, very quickly, on the implementation question, obviously the states have been reluctant, but it also is a historical question because in India, cities, the local government is just one player. The elected municipal corporation is just one player among a galaxy of actors who are responsible for urban governance. Many of them are called as parastatal agencies, which deliver services or which actually carry out development and planning functions. But these agencies have no accountability, no level of accountability to the local government. They have limited accountability to the state government. So no sense of local accountability to multiple agencies, and you have fragmentation of political and administrative power at the level of the city. And that's the design, that's more of the implementation of how the states have implemented the constitutional revision. And secondly, the courts also have failed in recognizing the power of cities. You would actually notice that Indian judiciary is known as an activist judiciary, taking a huge role in terms of administrative governance issues. But when it comes to questions of local government, it has been conservative. It has taken a very conservative view. It has not interpreted the 74th Amendment to the benefit of local government. And I just have about a minute left. So quickly concluding, what does this raise? I mean, what do these questions sort of bring about? I think what in the context of the book, what is an important question for all constitutional scholars to ask, especially in the Indian context, is that whether there is a relationship between constitutional entrenchment of local government powers or city government and the reality of those cities exercising powers. And the comparative constitutional law scholarship has not addressed this question, the relationship between constitutional entrenchment of local government powers and its actual powers. And I think it's a really important question. What Dr. Hirschl's book does is that it introduces that topic. It it allows us to have those discussions, and to some extent covers a wide range of countries, especially Brazil, India, South Africa, to answer this question. But I believe we would need, scholars from Asia would need to look at this more closely, come up with, more sort of papers and other, scope of, other ways of examining this question. And I think, this book allows us to sort of take scholarship in that direction. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. And obviously, I very much appreciate what you said about how the book focuses on where the cities are and not where the institutions are. And I suppose Ran is quite the right person to advise us to go beyond what he calls the usual suspects. So we will sort of perhaps come back to some of these questions that you have raised about de facto and de jure power. But for now, I would like to go to Professor Wen-Chen, who will be speaking from the perspective of partly from Taiwan and perhaps probably from Asia as well. Wen-Chen, on to you.
Thank you, Jaclyn. And it's my honor and pleasure to join this 10th virtual roundtable already. I think I was in the first, and now it's already in the 10th. And again, I would like to offer my big congratulations to Ran for this wonderful book. another book, but I think this book definitely carries a special importance to comparative constitutional studies, to really study this very much under-theorized status of city in constitutionalism, but also in comparative constitutional study. And I very much agree that Asia, as well as Global South, would offer, a very important contextual dynamics under which these further theories and these further constitutional design can be explored. So I want to, because we don't have much time, I want to really go directly to the point. So I found this contrast between federalism and unitary systems, and under which cities can have very different status. And this is very true to not only federalist countries in the West, but I think it's also very true to different countries in Asia. As you can see, in Asia, we mostly have unitary states. Very few states in Asia have federal systems. And that's probably, I suspect, the reason that then you find many Asian constitutions will have some sort of constitutional status for city. So I just like to offer one example, and I think you also discussed this thoroughly in the book, is the kind of cities directly under the central government. It's very rare in the West, but it's actually quite common in Asia. So believe it or not, in Taiwan, we have 5 such cities directly under the central authority. And this kind of design was already in the first Republic of China Constitution. But the reason certainly not for some sort of democratization, bottom-up empowering of the cities, but really for centralization of the state. So in China, when the first constitution was thought of and was stipulated, certainly having provinces, right, and then federalism as an idea of design was rejected. But then the central government was also in great fear of allowing the provinces to control of those big cities that are already there, and then with more population and resources. So one idea to counterbalance the provincial power is to have the cities directly under the central government. So if you look from this historical and also political perspective, then you certainly understand why there are so many cities in Asia that are under central government. So just also to give you some practical examples in Taiwan. So we have 5 cities: Taipei, New Taipei City, Kaohsiung, Tainan, Taoyuan. These cities, in the law, they are, and in the constitution, they are directly under national central authority. What's the impact? They actually are invited in the cabinet meeting. So they have a seat aside from the ministers. So they are actually sitting beside Minister of Interior, Minister of Defense, Minister of Agriculture. So they have some say in joining the discussions about how this national budget is going to be allocated, how these national policies are going to do, right? So I think on the one hand, from the perspective now, you can see this is, wow, the empowerment of the city. But on the other very different perspective, you can see this is actually the centralization of the resources out there belonging to city, but then the national government doesn't want those to be controlled by the provinces or the subsidiary levels, right? And so I think in Asia, we also need to be mindful of this power play, this balancing relationship, and to then observe cities, right? And so in Taiwan, the Taipei city mayor is often seen as the next potential presidential candidate. And this being also true in South Korea, right? The mayor of Seoul will be probably, the next person in the line, right? And so this kind of dynamic is something that very much present in Asian politics. So that's one. And the second is, so among those cities that are placed directly under central authorities, there's also one salient kind of mega city or city. You also discussed that in the book, is capital city, right? And so in a way that Taipei is capital city to Taiwan, and in a way Seoul is the capital city in South Korea. Right, and Tokyo, to the very extent also playing such role, and then Beijing certainly to that extent for China. And so in those capital cities, you definitely see the power play between the national politics and city politics, right? Because on the one hand, when the city mayor of capital city is running the city, he is also, or she is also running the whole compound of the national agencies, courts, and so on and so forth, right? So you see a lot of protests against the national policies, but also protests against the city, right? So that kind of blurring boundaries between the local government and the national government is often very much in play in capital city. And I think that's also the reason why you often see when national president will have the agenda to say, relocate the capital city somewhere else away from capital. Whereas the city mayor of the capital city would say, oh, we are going to be staying right here, and then we are going to expand the kind of thing. So it's one way to see these from the real politics, but it's another way to see from the constitutional law point of view, right? And I think you will not be surprised that all these kind of cities will have the standing in the legal system. I think in Taiwan, in China, in South Korea, in Japan. But then when they are imagined, and we have plenty of those litigation actually, imagine that Taipei City is suing Taiwan government, right? What does that mean? So that's, I think, when you have that very elaborate legal rules concerning that kind of city and national government in a unitary state, not in a federalist state, but in a unitary state, you see the rules are very complex. And then our constitutional court also had various times already to adjudicate the dispute between Taipei City and the national government, right? And imagine that kind of adjudication is, I think, to the extent also very similar to judicial rulings on mega politics, right? Although on the law, it's the national government and city, but that kind of city is not that kind of city typically under local government, right? So I think that's also one way. If you continue to research this area, on the one hand, you are not satisfied with the constitutional status right now in the West, in the most federalist countries. But then imagine that it also will take a lot of lawyering efforts to smooth out all these conflicts between the cities and the central government when we want to elevate the status of the cities in constitutional systems. And I don't have much time left, but let me pose perhaps a reflection and also a challenge to you in the context where I was or has been discussing, right? Because in Asia, the reason to empower a city is very different from the kind of, and you also acknowledge, bottom-up democratization effort, right? The thoughts were totally different, right? To empower the central government really for the resources out there. And then when you take that in mind, then whether or not to continue, if I may say in Asia, right, to continue empowering cities is a good thing or bad thing if we evaluate and think this against the backdrop of now the whole world that is very divisive, right? Looking the US, looking at many other European states, right? And you also acknowledge that because precisely that kind of cosmopolitan nature of the cities, city people are often different people than the people in the country, right? So in Taiwan, we often call nations within nations, right? Taipei City is a nation within the nation of Taiwan, right? So then when we try to empower city, that's in the backdrop of today's politics, is again to see the problems of national unity, to see the problem of national cohesion, and so on and so forth. So I would also like to give you a question that you are also an expert on identity, right? On all these issues. Then how will you reconcile, you know, the empowerment of the cities? And then, you know, on the other hand, you are going to face perhaps more divisiveness, you know, in the constitutional system where I have been just talking about, but also in a law and society fashion, or in a law and society setting that really people of a city are sometimes different people of the nation, right? And then thinking now, the election, the US election just passed, you can find so many examples, right? The city probably vote, have very different vote from the vote of the people in the province or in the state or in the lander if it's in the European setting. So that's, I think, is also the challenge we are facing. I would just stop now, but I also have a minor point is the status of the city in the international law, but we can discuss that later or in the follow-up forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Wen-Chen. That's fascinating. I mean, that's a really important question about the impact of empowering cities, whether it ends up disempowering the rest, and what will that say for the identity of the nation. Ran, if you don't mind, can we leave your response to after Kevin? Yeah. Okay. So last but not least, we have Kevin Tan, who is obviously an expert in many things, including constitutional law. Kevin, on to you.
Thank you very much, Jaclyn. First off, Ran, thank you very much for this wonderful book. I had great time reading it and learned a lot about the different conditions of cities and mega cities throughout the world. I had no idea that in Asia the situation was as dire as you've managed to paint out for us. I could stop here and say I agree with everything you said in the book, but I won't. I do agree with the points that you've made in the sense that yes, the city has never been in the constitutional landscape, has not featured at all. It's a blind spot. It continues to elude our constitutional imagination. But I think your book is timely in addressing the fact that we are in a kind of a crisis at the moment when you look at the situation. My remarks are going to fall within sort of two categories. I know Jaclyn wanted me to talk about it in the context of Singapore, but Singapore really isn't a mega city. We would not be anywhere near the top. We are only 5.5 million people. We're already complaining that's too many people, but I mean, if you compare that with the mega cities like Tokyo, Dhaka, and so on, we're nothing. But I will say something about the juxtaposition of cities within or states that are in fact cities. But I want to address a much larger question of reform, right? I agree that we need to rethink this. So the question is, how do we rethink this? Now, you've given a few options. One of them is, of course, this idea of subsidiarity, of giving greater autonomy. So your point about giving constitutional status to cities is largely dependent on the fact that once you have certain constitutional status, you've got certain power, certain political power, certain and very important, powers of taxation, right? Powers of raising money. So you don't end up being subservient to sort of predatory mega corporations like Amazon and so on. Now that's one argument. Now, to me, some of this, I suppose, at a practical level would work very well. In other words, if we started to tinker, right, and I use the word tinker rather than totally, you know, renovate. If you think around with constitutional systems and say, yes, I think we now acknowledge that you know, we've got these big major cities, we've got to treat them a little differently from the rest of the population, and then you do tweaks, constitutional tweaks, and so on. Maybe it'll work. Maybe it worked. I don't know. But the point is that I think you're gonna come up against a serious inertia on the part of states who if you wanted to do this in a really serious way, would have to rethink the entire nature of the state, what the state's functions are, what must a state do and provide for the people who live within its territory, right? Now, this calls for, in fact, a total rethinking of what a state is all about. And in a sense, you've got two major sort of criteria you need to look at. One, of course, is geography that you talk about. The other one is demography, right? So where the people, and in terms of geography, and what is the nature of the demographics, right? How diverse is it? It's certainly a lot easier if you're looking at mega cities in countries which population is a little bit more homogeneous. So if you're looking at China, for example, you know, they speak different languages at a regional level, but they all speak Mandarin. You know, culturally, there is a certain similarity. I wouldn't say it's totally homogeneous, but it's a lot easier managing that kind of society if you wanted to take into account your mega cities into your constitutional equation. The moment you have a very segmented society where you have, you know, very, very different groups, whether it's segregated by language, religion, ethnicity, or a combination of all of that, then that becomes really, really difficult to manage. Then the question of the geography itself, where are your resources allocated? It's one thing to talk about a mega city that is generating tremendous income for the entire state, right? The entire country, so to speak. And as opposed to one that's going to suck out all the resources out of that country. So if you've got a very rich, say, rural hinterland with mineral resources and that sort of thing, then your cities are going to be a liability rather than a plus point on your balance sheet. Whereas in certain countries where your cities are actually generating a bulk of the income because of services or manufacturing or what have you, it obviously is going to matter more. Now, why should any of this matter? Well, obviously, you can't think only as a city if these things were at stake. So if you are a city that is reliant on the hinterland, you can't say, well, I want to have a total autonomy. You know, I only deal with what municipal matters I need to deal with, because at the end of the day, I can give you the power of taxation, but you don't have people to tax, right? Because you are a negative. You are a cost center as opposed to be a profit center, so to speak. So where your resources are allocated, I think must count. And so every state in that regard has to rethink how it's going to juggle these dynamics, right? The other problem, of course, which I hope maybe you will deal with in maybe your next book or an article following up on this book, is how do we restructure the way political parties think about national power? How do I capture national power, right? I mean, that's the ultimate of every ultimate sort of endpoint for all political parties. I'm not interested in capturing just the city. I want to capture national power. So how do I capture national power, given that you've got cities around? And anyone thinking through this would be very reluctant to allow too many alternative centers of power to develop. So if you've got mega cities, and as Wen-Chen rightly pointed out, and you've also pointed it out in your book, you don't want prominent mayors, because these guys are going to be your competitors for votes. So you've either got to somehow make sure it's your guy who is the mayor, all right, or you somehow co-opt the mayor into your party. One way or the other, these parties, and I was struck by this phrase on page 35, where you talked about the state's existential fear of large cities, because they're kind of frightening, because they can serve as nurseries for potentially unruly radicalization, leading to an undermining of state power and possibly even to political revolution. I was really hoping that you would have developed that theme more, because it is at the center of political power. I mean, if I've got a city that is a disaster, right, a mega city that's a disaster, that's a liability, well, unless I think that that is the way which will allow me to capture political power, then I would focus politics in the other regions, right? So you've got to rethink first the nature of the state. You've got to rethink the nature of political parties. You've got to figure out, right, where your resources lie, whether it's human capital or it's natural resources and so on. And you rightly pointed out in the book that at a national level you can easily justify the moving of resources to sort of cross-subsidize the richer parts of the state, cross-subsidizing the poorer parts of the state, whether it be from the city to the rural or rural to the city. But if you think only as a mega city, then I think those equations have somehow got to be factored into the equation. I don't have an answer. I'm just thinking through how difficult it might be. And so from a sort of a constitutional theory and a comparative constitutional law point of view, do we have the tools that are necessary for us to undertake this work? Should we be minded to do so? And I think the answer is actually yes, right? There's a mountain of literature already on electoral studies and on how you apportion power, how you apportion voting, so many studies. You've got a mountain of literature on federalism, devolution, municipal local government against the center. Again, you've got all that sort of stuff. And of course, there are all these studies on political parties as well. So the point I'm trying to make is that actually the tools exist. What we need to do is to somehow master them into a way that will allow these disciplines to talk to each other and then formulate something. Let me just end very quickly, because it's about Singapore. Singapore is a city-state, very small, 5.5 million people, and there is really no serious distinction between the city and the state. But let me say that we were not always this way. Back in 1958, when Singapore attained self-government, and I've been studying the sort of boundaries devolution reports and the delineation reports. They were really concerned with the fact that much development was actually concentrated in what we call the city center, what is now our sort of banking, commercial, financial center in the southern part of Singapore. And the planners who were working through this were very mindful of how they delineated the electoral boundaries. And they went to great lengths to explain or justify why certain constituencies were geographically much larger than others. So the city center obviously was subdivided further into very, very small constituencies, geographically very small. I mean, spatially very small, but very, very dense, right? And as opposed to sort of the rural parts. And this featured greatly in the minds of the committees that were subsequent. Now, in the Singapore system, what happens is a delineation electoral boundaries delineation committee is appointed prior to every single general election. So this preoccupied them from 1958 all the way right up to the 1970s. By which time what had happened in Singapore was that because of the success of the public housing scheme, the populations became much more evenly distributed throughout the island. In the meantime, they had agreed that they would accept a 20% variation from the mean or the average size of the constituency. So in other words, 20% more for the larger ones and 20% less. Now that actually represents quite a big gap. The irony in the case of Singapore, of course, and this is going into the territory of gerrymandering and electoral politics, is that after they actually evened out all the constituencies, more or less, right? You had this nice mix of both, sort of rural, urban, and so on. They actually accepted a 30% deviation from the norm, which, to my mind, can't really be justified, but continues to exist in today's system. So let me end here. Ran, thank you very much. Very stimulating book, and lots more fodder for great discussions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I see you tried to put in your brief response to your brief on Singapore. Thank you for that. Ran, I guess Wen-Chen has a specific question for you, which actually intersects with a question from one of our participants, Nandanai Nachan, who also asked how, if we constitutionalize a powerful city, will this not create an inequilibrium between the city and the rest? And how will this also sort of affect the sense of nationality? I think the question of identity that Wen-Chen raised earlier. So if you like, perhaps you could take this question, and then we will go to a few more. There are actually right now 6 or 7 questions in the Q&A. So on to you.
Thank you, Jaclyn. And thank you to Matthew and Wen-Chen and Kevin for this really challenging set of comments. And if I may say, in general, obviously there's lots on the table. If there's anything that I take from those 3 sets of comments before I turn to the question, is that there's lots to be done and lots to be thought about in this context. And in that respect, I view the book, let's compare a work such as, this book that we are currently discussing and the issue it raises, to other issues in constitutional law, say freedom of expression or constitutional design, as in presidentialism, semi-presidentialism, parliamentarism, etc. As Kevin said, there's a mountain of literature on each of these issues. So obviously, in the scope of 300 pages of what I think is a first or among the first books that try to do this, there's only that much one can do. And I take it as a big compliment that the book raises so many interesting thoughts about where we go from here. And if there's one message that I want all the audience to leave the proverbial room here with, is that we've only begun to scratch the surface of this major challenge to constitutional designers, to politicians, and indeed to the world, to humanity. And we need to collectively, we constitutional thinkers, need constitutional experts, need to, as Kevin said, get together and begin, with, in an interdisciplinary fashion, get together and begin to think creatively about all these things. So in that respect, the book is more of an invitation to begin a conversation on a subject that has been strangely neglected and overlooked, rather than a recipe for solving all these problems. Let's leave it at that. On the urban-rural divide, this is of course a major challenge, and I already have a follow-up article that addresses this. I will just say, of course, we cannot go into great detail here because our time is very short. I will say that, of course, generally, this is the main theoretical challenge here, how to balance a unique status to cities without altering the general national framework. And so I don't believe, at least it was not my intention when I wrote this book, to suggest that we should adopt radical solutions such as changing the identity basis of the modern state with a locality-based identity. Rather, what I thought would be a more reasonable solution is to try to think creatively about constitutional designs aimed at at the same time granting some taxation authority to cities and constitutional standing to cities without alienating or further alienating non-urban voters or residents. In that respect, we can only scratch the surface of this now. I should say that I discuss things like community standards, doctrines like the community standards doctrine, in the context of European law, margin of appreciation and deference to localities and local interpretation. The idea that it need not be that we must adopt a pan-statist single interpretation of the Constitution across the territory, and there may be some leeway in local input into interpreting the Constitution. Another thing that some of the commentators alluded to is thinking about electoral systems, creative, smart electoral systems. For example, joint rural-urban electoral districts. It's not such a crazy idea. For example, split rural-urban so that in urban areas, we have proportional representation. In urban areas, in rural areas, we have first past the post, and then we have an added quota that is granted to residents of rural areas so as to compensate for their lesser voice. So we cannot go into details, but I try to scratch the surface of this in the book, but definitely it is not my intention to empower cities at the expense of other regions or areas of the country. Rather, it is an invitation to think creatively via the tools of constitutional design and electoral apportionment, etc., on how to strike a right balance between more power to cities without further alienating other regions. Let me also add one more thing. This entire rural-urban divide is not as neat and dichotomous and clear as the phrase may suggest, because in reality, much of urban agglomeration worldwide takes a form of suburban development. So it's not entirely clear that we talk about urban versus rural. There is a huge, at least in the Western countries I'm familiar with, there is this phenomenon that we call urban sprawl. It makes it very difficult to draw the line between the city and the non-city, the urban and the rural. And one of the major difficulties here in terms of design, I will conclude with that, is unlike the statist approach that is clearly dominant in our thinking about constitutional design, in a state, we know who the members are. They are citizens or not. They hold passports. There are borders, not only in the cartographic sense, but border in the sense that the country or the army defends those borders. You cannot come in, you cannot get out without some control. In cities or in urban areas, it's much more flexible. So it's difficult. The basic challenge here is even to determine who belongs to the demos. Who exactly is the urban demos and belongs to the urban demos? In short, there's a myriad of challenges here, and I only begin to think about this. The bottom line of all of this is the neglect of this issue is not a solution, and given the mounting urban challenge, we need to go back to the drawing board and begin to shake up all those statist understandings of territoriality and sovereignty and begin to think more creatively about what has emerged here over the last 200 years since all those concepts of federalism in subnational units were first put on the table. There's new development, and constitutional thought has not kept up with this. Thanks.
Thank you, Ren. So we do have, as I mentioned, a few questions. What I'm going to do is group some of the questions, perhaps rephrase them to the extent that you have already addressed some of the issues raised. So let me go to Andrew Harding's question, where he asked he asked, in light of Wen-Chen's and Kevin's comments, and assuming an enhanced rules for cities, can you outline a system or identify a few factors relevant to designing such a system for intergovernmental relations? So one of the issues would be what you've already said, urban versus non-urban residents. How do you manage and balance those interests? I think another thing that did come up in Matthew's comments was also the idea of overlapping authorities, right? The fact that the city itself is a locality with many authorities claiming power over. So how would we sort of balance these various interests in addressing intergovernmental relations?
Thank you, Jaclyn, and of course, thank you to Andrew. And I should mention or acknowledge publicly that Andrew is one of the few scholars who studies that aspect, perhaps more in the context of local government in Asia. And I mentioned his work in the book as one of the few exceptions to this overarching and inexplicable to me neglect of the issue. Specifically, the best we've got so far is sections or articles 151 to 164 of South Africa's constitution. So this should be a starting model. I'm not saying it's perfect. It has lots of issues, but when we take stock of what work has been done in terms of addressing intergovernmental relations and taking into account all the various interests involved, as Matthew suggested, India, maybe there's good intention there. We can argue about that, but the implementation certainly has not been a big success for all the reasons that Matthew mentioned: design and judicial interpretation, first and foremost. But at the other end, perhaps the most success, I certainly agree with Wen-Chen that the Asian Tigers model is not a bottom-up, is not a democracy-driven. This is a central government trying to, we can argue what the motives are, what the incentives are, but it's definitely not empowering the people. Okay, I think we can agree on that. So again, the most significant model currently on offer is the South African Constitution, and it requires some, if I may add another minute, the apartheid era with all its horrors, one of the dirty tricks it did, it essentially used the authority of the government to exclude certain neighborhoods from the boundaries of cities so that rights of cities do not apply to those neighborhoods. And we all know who resided in those neighborhoods and etc. So the history is well known. What that chapter of the new South African Constitution did, it rewrote the entire intergovernmental relations in that country in a direct defiance of the apartheid era. It has been quite successful for a first, and I would say this is the first comprehensive attempt in global constitutionalism or in world constitutions to address this A to Z. It's quite successful, surprisingly so. Let me just conclude my answer in saying, so I would ask Andrew to take a look at that chapter of the South African Constitution, but just saying that in 2010, 10 years ago, the South African Constitutional Court rendered a landmark decision concerning the rights of Johannesburg in terms of land use and planning, as opposed to the state, Gauteng, within which Johannesburg is located. And the South, unlike the Indian Supreme Court, as Matthew suggested earlier, the South African Constitutional Court specifically went with the city of Johannesburg and granted it all the constitutional rights in terms of land use and planning, etc. The result has been the adoption of a tremendously progressive social housing, public housing policy by the city of Johannesburg that essentially means at least 30% of every new construction project for residents must include social housing. This, by Singapore or Hong Kong proportions, may not seem a lot. By beyond those two countries, this is a world record, and certainly in the context of South Africa. So my answer is South Africa is the base point, is a starting point, and we begin to build from there. That's my vision.
So we do have a bit of time because I started a bit late. So I'm going to give you one last question, if you don't mind. I know it's very late over there in Toronto. So there are two questions that really ask for your views on Lefebvre's right to the city. Jaclyn asked, is it likely that states will actually constitutionalize this right? Because it seems like one of those socioeconomic rights of high abstraction that many states will be quite reluctant to include in the written constitution. Diraj Nainani also sort of asked if you could elaborate more of how this right to the city could actually be applied in constitutional thought. So if you don't mind, I'll just hold you on for a few more minutes to answer these questions.
Thank you for both questions. And the right to the city is really a challenging concept. So for those of you who are not into this is more political theory or perhaps even radical thought. This dates back, it hasn't been invoked commonly in constitutional thought, and this is one of the things I'm trying to do in this book. It goes back to the 60s, late 60s, and I don't want to designate it as Marxist because it's too reductionist, but it has this embedded revolutionary idea that the urban space belongs to all the residents, and it has this participatory democracy element embedded in it. The problem is that, as I explain in the book, Lefebvre's ideas were left at a largely abstract level without detailing a set of duties and specifications and concrete rights. Who is supposed to do what? Who owes what to whom? And so it was left as a concept, as a broad concept, without any concretization. And over time, it sort of left the constitutional realm altogether and became a sort of debate or a concept that is debated among radical urban thinkers rather than among constitutional thinkers. The two attempts, perhaps, the most concrete attempts to address the concept and to sort of, it's not the right term, but to domesticate it, to constitutionalize, to turn it from a wild, unruly, potentially radical idea into something that may be constitutionalized and litigated and thought of in constitutional terms. The first such attempt was in the constitutional world was the Constitution of Brazil of 1988, where there was a serious discussion of what to do with the right to the city in a national constitution. And the two provisions there, 182, 183, that attempt to do precisely that. Again, they haven't been able to avoid the political control over this, and certainly not in the current era of Bolsonaro, etc., as I explain in the book. But there's an interesting attempt in Brazil, and those of you who are interested in this question, I will send you to read all the research by scholars based in Brazil on how the right to the city has been reformulated by constitutional thinkers in Brazil. The second is, and there's an array of answers there, so no need for me to repeat that now, but that's your address. And the second is Mexico City. So the concept in Mexico City has always been, has also been, and this is a process that took place from 2013 to 2017 on how to realize the right to the city in the context of writing a constitution to that city. And there too, it has taken a very progressive tone of, not just social housing and the obvious set of rights to the residents, but also consultation with neighborhoods and residents, and cutting ties, at least to the extent that possible, and goes back to one of Kevin's points, with business and the idea that the more taxation and autonomy the city may have, the less its structural dependence will be on corporate interests. And this is another aspect we couldn't address in this talk, but I touch upon it in the book. So again, just as the South African example is our starting point on imagining a new set of intergovernmental relations that takes into account city interests, when it comes to constitutionalizing the right to the city, that is fuzzy, abstract, overly theoretical, overly philosophical, in terms of concretizing it and making it applicable to the constitutional arena, the two obvious debates and obvious settings to study are Brazil 1988 and the new constitution adopted by Mexico City 2017, and the debates there. And maybe I'll conclude here. That's another point that Matthew make, and it's just borders on outrageous that articles and books on the American urban scene do not pay attention to these attempts to really address the urban issue. And if you read, I read dozens of articles by Brazilian scholars and by Mexican scholars, and the level of conversation there is absolutely stunning. It's incredibly sophisticated. So the time has come, for those of you who are interested in the right to the city, to read Henri Lefebvre's book on this, and maybe shift from the political philosophy aspect of this right to the more concrete constitutional right, and take a look at what scholars in Brazil and Mexico have done on this. It's impressive.
Thank you, Ran. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. We do have several questions, but I apologize we could not get to all of these questions, but I encourage all of you to get a copy of this book. I've just been told that actually it's still available on Amazon, so fastest fingers first. But please also join me in thanking Ran, Matthew, Wen-Chen, and Kevin for this stimulating discussion, and of course Ran for this stunning book. And I hope that all of you will join us for our next virtual roundtable event, and enjoy the rest of your day or morning or night, wherever you are. Thank you.